Hey there, welcome to Quick Connect. This is Alex. Today we're going to talk about use of emojis in our conversations with others, especially now where working from home and remote working is very prevalent. So maybe let's begin with the context of emojis. When should we use emojis, right? Especially in a professional context, should we even be using emojis at all? Ethan, what do you think?
I think especially when you're talking about a scenario where you can't see people's face, emojis help. I realized that when you just add a smiley face at the end of an email, even if it's an official email, it does change up the tone quite a bit. And so it depends on what you want to achieve, right? So it's about, are you looking for something a little bit more relatable, or are you looking for something a little bit more formal?
Hmm. So I guess it also depends on whether in office whether the communication context itself was formal or informal, because we have both of those contexts, and also whether you're communicating internally or communicating with a client, an external party,
Yeah,
which
certainly.
again also changes the context, right? So when would be a good time to use emojis?
Of course, informal is the best time. I've seen it used in simple forms in formal settings just to add a little bit more twist to it. For example, just a typical smiley with an equal and a bracket. That is simple enough. You're not talking about full on emojis where you're like having a sticker on there. Uh, like that would have been a very different story, right? So that would be too informal versus something simple like just a smiley.
Right. So in most contexts, smileys can communicate, make things a bit softer, especially when you're communicating something, and the text itself could be ambiguous, right? We talked about assumptions earlier. So
Yeah.
when we use emojis, it's to try to convey emotions through text, which is
Yes.
often missing, right? So as we start to do that, we could have smiley face or rolling on the floor laughing face, or laugh
Yes.
until you cry face, or angry face, right? So I think all these faces creates helps people to relax a little bit when they communicate over text and remotely.
Mm. I, I think it sets an intention in mind because usually we read intention by the emotions of the person. So if a person is angry, we assume that it is out to get you. So if we cannot imagine whether the person's happy, sad, angry, or just a little bit like confused, we can't tell the intention behind the message. I'm pretty sure you have had experience where you met this person, but then the moment you're on message, you realize this person doesn't talk the way that you thought they talk like in real life.
Hmm. And that's
Yeah.
because tonality and other things aren't communicated through text.
Absolutely, and that's a struggle of different generations as well. Because my parents, the way they text is without smileys, so you cannot imagine how they are speaking unless you actively try to do so.
Is it also then possible to communicate contradictory messages? So I can imagine, right? Sometimes we are angry, we want to communicate something that doesn't sound very good. It comes across the text, and then to soften it a little bit, the person puts a smiley face at the end of it.
Okay, so this is the best part, right? Emoji does not soften your language.
Yeah, so it goes like, I think that was a really stupid thing to do with smiley face.
Then they look sarcastic. So I mean, but that's exactly how you'll behave in real life too. I think that was really stupid.
Okay, true, true. So I guess in some ways your emoji also does. I guess it communicates sarcasm as well, like you
Yes, it
said.
does.
Yeah.
So it changes a lot of dimensions of the communication. I think that's what is great about emojis, and I think it's a very important part of the process, because it emotes the thing that most people have difficulty getting.
Hmm. No, I suspect that it's easier to get sarcasm in person than over text. So while you're right that if I said something like that with a smiley face, it could imply sarcasm, but it may also cause confusion to someone else who doesn't quite get it.
I mean, then okay, because we're usually when sarcasm, we're used to it in a certain context, right? Again, emotions are an interesting thing, right? How we interpret emotions is really important. Having discordant emotions from between the language and the actions by right should give us the, oh, this person is sarcastic. But because we've never experienced it on text, before like this very intense period where we're all working from home, you probably never really experienced sarcasm on text on a professional setting. Here comes the part. I've experienced enough sarcasm on text from relationships and friendships that were full of sarcastic people that if a person is sarcastic, I can get it right away. So I have the context to understand it in different multiple contexts. But do you have? That's also the struggle here, right? Which is why it's difficult. So it's also about having why emojis are very useful is because you need to get used to it almost like how you read a person.
Right. So I guess the history that you have with that person makes it important because then you have the context of understanding. And that brings us back to the point that look, the context becomes important in communicating with a external party, a client. Then it's not so suitable to use emojis. Are there contexts where it's actually appropriate to use emojis with clients?
Emoticons actually, I think that's where the difference in statements is, right? Emojis, most people typically think of the things. Emoticons, it can be your equal or your colon and bracket. Those are the simple ones that can convey your message across without looking too informal.
Right. So emoticons are the text.
Yeah, on the text version of the emojis.
Right. And the emojis are the actual pictures, right? The
Yes.
smiley face. Okay, so emoticons would probably be safer in
Yes.
a professional context when you want to communicate, whereas not the pictures which can be come across as too informal.
Yep, and it at least very often softens up the stuff because you cannot convey everything through language. Again, you cannot unless you want to state out my intention of sending this message is to let you know that I'm perfectly happy. Seriously, how many people write it?
Right. So the other thing that probably comes across for using of emojis and emoticons is different generations. Right. So if we're speaking to a baby boomer generation versus a Gen X or millennial, their response or comfort level or even perception of emojis and emoticons are entirely different.
Mm. Most of them don't really. I realize that a lot of the older generation do not. It's either they overuse it or they don't use it. So for me, my experience with that, it's either they are super savvy and they use it all the time, or they don't use it at all.
Right.
Because again, lack of exposure, lack of upbringing in the environment of text. Yeah.
So one of the things that like some of us work with young adults, right? People who just entered the workforce, and should we use emojis with them to build relationship, or do things get too informal and then it becomes difficult to work with the person? Is there a guideline for something like that?
So it depends on what kind of leadership you want to have, right? So if you're hierarchical, do not use any. You know, if you're more of a person who's quite equal with everybody, then you need to recognize that there are moments where you use the emoji, certain type of emoji. So we go back to this, right? So everybody has their favorite emojis, true?
Yep.
In casual setting and then in the formal setting. So it's funny because formal setting just means I use a certain set of emojis or emoticons. And then on casual mode, I'll be using more bombastic or more like in your face kind of emojis or even full on GIFs to communicate something to some people. So the casualness ramps up according to what kind of mode you're talking to them as, right? Because if you're a leader versus you're not a leader, like it creates a different environment altogether. There is your focus. Again, it goes back to your purpose. What are you trying to communicate?
And the other thing that was interesting was I think the channels becomes important because the channel sets the context. During this time of circuit breaker, whereby people are a bit isolated, some leaders actually create informal chat groups to remain connected and in communication with one another. So in my organization, our leaders actually created a chat group. They call it the wellness chat group, right? Whereby people can come together, share about non-work related stuff, or even share jokes and things like that. So in that particular context, it's probably you could use emojis and emoticons to communicate because it's very casual. You want to be able to be social with one another rather than all business-like, right? So that would probably be a good context. And then in other contexts, when it's more formal in tone, then probably avoid it.
So I mean, I will extend this to like the pantry talk.
Okay.
So if the wellness check group is like the pantry talk, so I mean, there's the other thing is within my co-working space and my company, like we've used this other app that allows us to imitate. If I'm working during the day, I can sit at my desk, and then I can go to the pantry in case anybody wants to meet me there, and then we can have a conversation over there. And that's when, yeah. So if you're talking about creating context, people also can use certain methods like this to create that differentiation. Because at the end of the day, if you're meeting the person in the meeting room versus in the pantry, you're going to talk very differently for most people.
Okay, so the other thing about emojis is since they are not text-based, can it miscommunicate?
Yeah, have you seen people using the brinjal or the okra or like the eggplant? A person in the older generation versus a Tinder generation person would have completely different innuendos involved. If you're talking about GIFs, without the reference of the original memes, a lot of GIFs are also lost on people. So it really, really depends on how you, I mean, again, it's knowing your audience, what you're trying to communicate and trying to utilize it properly.
Cool. Anything else you want to add to the topic?
Yeah, I was thinking about really going to, it's important to also learn, okay, one of the things that happens in meetings that is really funny is that, okay, if you're in a real life meeting, there's usually a person in the room that will probably end up breaking the cycle of the rhythm. You know, there'll be a person who fidgets a bit more. There'll be some weird sound in the corner. But if you notice, if everybody's on mute, right? So if I did that all the way through, all my fidgety weirdness will be out of the room. So this is where casualness actually becomes a useful thing. There's a reason why they call it Zoom fatigue or virtual conferencing fatigue. Casualness in random moments in meetings is what keeps the meetings going.
Right. So perhaps even when you do a virtual meeting, you have a chat group, you could use emojis and emoticons to create that casualness to help people to talk and communicate, and that could probably be useful.
Yeah, and then they might have a private conversation on the side, this kind of things, which is normal in a meeting, right? The reason why people get fatigued out on video conferencing and all these kind of groups is because they don't have their back channel. They don't have their little communication media that they can talk to one another with. They don't have all these little things. So the ability to actually break the flow, I mean, again, it depends on the leadership, right? But during meetings, during all these kind of things, it drastically changes the direction and the vibe of the conversation. And with that, you can end up having an 8-hour conversation on Zoom and still feel energized. Versus what a lot of people feel is that, oh, I'm so burnt out from doing all these calls. Yes, because you're having to fill up the distance between feeling how people feel, is you can't feel how people feel, and this is you actually reading the whole room.
So I guess if we were to summarize what you spoke about, emojis are very useful, powerful communication tools if you know how to use them appropriately in the correct context. You can change the environment, you can create that casualness with people, and therefore even during this time when we're remote working or working from home, it helps you to build that social communication aspects with one another.
I would extend it just one little bit. I would say that it is a great thing to start introducing emojis into more formal scenarios or emoticons, only because it allows for communication that otherwise wouldn't have appeared.
Which is true. Cool. So that's all the time we have for today in this session on emojis. The next session, we're going to talk about how do we have quality conversations with youth and teenagers. So if you're working from home, you probably deal a lot more with your teenagers at home. Or if you were working with interns or fresh grads, you might then need to have different types of communications with them. So we'll see you at the next video. Bye.
Bye.